All right, it's New Year's Eve and we're saying goodbye to 2024. This morning we are breaking down the top 9 legal cases of the year. Our 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor joins us with this list. Thanks for coming in.
Sure, this took me a lot longer to do than I expected.
I had a feeling, and it's so interesting because you kind of forget about some of these cases and you're bringing them back to the forefront. So many big cases. So first, how did you even narrow it down to 9?
Yeah, and you mentioned it. So we did over 100 cases over the year, and so there were just a lot. And so what I came up with was a list of 9, because of course there could be, what's your definition of important?
Right.
So to me, it's what's relevant to Coloradans, what might have been interesting. Some of it's dealing with legislation, but we had cases across the board that were quite bizarre to that are going to really impact our lives.
Yeah, so we're counting down from 9 down to 1.
Yeah.
So this is the first one that we're going to talk about. This is a case that went national, a local story that went national, and you're talking about the train story. Yeah,
the train story where the police officers in Platteville and Fort Lupton left the victim really in the back of the vehicle and parked parked on the train tracks, resulting in really severe injuries. And I remember this case so vividly because she was watching it, the train coming and screaming, trying to get out. And that type of trauma was just so horrific. And so just the outrageousness of this case really was one of the reasons why it was number 9. And of course, that led to a civil settlement where she got $8.5 million. And some people said that's way too low, but the way it was an insurance policy that all of the attorney fees that were being spent on the other side were going to reduce what she could possibly recover. So she accepted $8.5 million because many people said that's not enough. Both of the officers were convicted of misdemeanors, and they are no longer on the force. So this was a case that just highlighted police misconduct at its highest.
Yeah, I've seen that video too many times, and every time I see it, it's just my stomach. It's so hard to watch. All right, so talk about case number 8 and 7.
So number 8 and 7. So number 8 was a case out of Michigan where the parents of the mass shooter were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. They are both serving 10 years. This was the first time in the country that parents were found liable. Right. And this case was obviously the significance, I think, is very noticeable. But it's really important because in a lot of these mass shootings, the victims, the survivors have went after a number of different people, including the gun manufacturers, and because of certain federal legislation, they've been very unsuccessful. So now you may see cases where parents are now being prosecuted. This one was unique though because the facts were so outrageous. I mean, there were so many red flags. The school asked for him to go home. The parents said no. They bought him the gun. They said, hey, he had these drawings of committing mass shootings, and they just ignored it. So the parents were really culpable in this case. Yeah,
even though it's not a Colorado case, it really can set precedents going forward in similar cases.
That's exactly right.
All right.
So number 7 was the National Association of Realtors settlement, antitrust settlement for $418 million. And that one was related to how in the real estate contracts and buy-sell contracts, the seller had been paying the buyers fees for their broker. And the allegation was that was antitrust and price fixing because both the buyer and seller were working together. And so they ultimately settled. And so now going forward, you can't, the seller is no longer obligated to pay the buyer's broker fee. Now they can, and as I understand it, they oftentimes do to still make it lucrative or to make it look good so they can get a buyer for their property. But that's no longer obligatory or mandatory as it was before.
That was a big shakeup in the real estate world for sure.
It really was, and there was a question on the impact, and I've talked to several realtors, and I don't think there's been a huge impact because I think there's still the desire to sell it, and that's kind of a point in making it lucrative.
How is it to have a mind like yours where it's just, like you went back through all of these 100 cases that we've
Yes.
talked about, and here you are just rattling off the facts about 3 of them?
Well, I won't tell you how long I spent getting
yeah.
the facts back in my head. I'm the type who takes the test and then forgets it afterwards.
Totally.
So, but thank goodness I have a good note-taking system.
I have a great short-term memory,
Yes.
and then long-term is not good.
Yeah.
It's not good. All right, so we're going to go through the rest of the list, 3 more in the next half hour, and then the last 3 coming up at 8:40.
Yes.
So Whitney's sticking around.
Yeah, I might have a wardrobe change.
Ooh, bow tie.
Oh,
I
you
love
gave it away.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
It's New Year's Eve, and we're saying goodbye to 2024. And this morning, we're breaking down the top 9 legal cases of the year.
That's right. We've covered 3 of them about half an hour ago. Now we're moving on to the next cases on the list with the help of 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor. Whitney, good morning once again to
Good
you.
morning. It's good to see you both.
Good to
bow
see
tie
you now.
right there.
Yes, little
Yes.
wardrobe change.
It's really quite intense, isn't it? It's an extreme change.
Well, next on the list, we have the Supreme Court's ruling on camping bans.
Yeah. No, this was an important one because we saw a lot of this litigation stemming out of Colorado because of the various camping bans in Denver and Aurora and Boulder. And so this went up and down to the Supreme Court. And one of the issues was, can you enforce a camping ban if there's no available beds? Does that violate the 8th Amendment cruel and unusual punishment? It got all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, that doesn't violate it's not an 8th Amendment violation. So that, in other words, if there's no beds available, the city can still enforce a camping ban. And I think the mayor of Denver, Mayor Johnson's doing a really good job dealing with this. This was one of his priorities, and I know he's getting people housing, even though as he's trying to get them off the street. I think Aurora, even though they were a little more aggressive on their camping ban, they're also trying to figure out ways to do it if there's no bed space available.
Yeah, that was a huge conversation this year. All right, so number 5 has to do with aviation.
Yes, aviation litigation. So I just lumped that in as one category. So aviation litigation, there's just been so much of that going on in terms of passengers' bills of right, these delays, cancellations, technology failing, so many different things. So there were, I think we did 6 or 7 different cases on that. And so essentially what the takeaway is consumers have way more rights. I think Pete Buttigieg with the Department of Transportation has done a phenomenal job advocating for consumers. So we have a lot more rights. You know, for example, if you're on the tarmac for more than 3 hours, they have to give you an option to get off. If your bags are delayed, they have to do these automatic refunds. There's significant penalties if they don't comply. I think some of them are $27,000 per passenger. So there's a lot of rights that we have as consumers now.
And then there's a case that we're actually still seeing playing out now that I think those of us here on 9 News Mornings and our friends at home know very well at this point. TikTok.
Yeah, that one's coming up. So we're going to know something in the next couple weeks because the legislation was passed that said by January 19th, TikTok or its owners, ByteDance, had to sell to an American company or it would be removed from these various platforms. And so they've challenged the law saying that it's unconstitutional, violates First Amendment freedom of speech, and the court is hearing arguments. So January 10th is the deadline for the briefs, and so we believe the court has put that expedited schedule together so that they can rule before the 19th. Before this deadline goes in. So if the court rules that, hey, this is unconstitutional, then the ban won't be in effect. But if they say, no, this law is valid, then the ban will go into effect on the 19th.
And we've talked about the timing of this, too, because we know that President-elect Trump has kind of maybe swayed back on allowing TikTok, but he doesn't get inaugurated until the 20th, and this is all happening on the 19th.
That's a great point. And so we're going to have to see what happens, but will they be able to enforce anything by the 20th? And I suspect the answer would be no. So could they start the prosecution within a day of it happening? I don't think so. And as you mentioned, our next president has met with them and said, well, it's It's not that bad of a company, foretelling he may be trying to figure out a way
He has
to make it work.
specifically filed a request,
Yeah.
actually, for them
right.
to rule.
Exactly, in the amicus brief. That's right, yeah.
All right, Whitney, thank you very much. We appreciate you as always.
All right.
As we wrap up the year, we're also wrapping up the top 9 legal cases of 2024.
Only the top 3 are left, and we're going through them with our 9 News legal expert, Whitney Traylor. Good
Yes.
morning.
Good morning. Yes, top 3 left.
All right, number 3, big case that directly impacted grocery stores that Coloradans use every day.
Yes, exactly. The Kroger-Albertsons merger, attempted merger. As we know, there were a multitude of lawsuits dealing with the antitrust violations, arguing that this merger would create an anti-competitive environment and it would be difficult for anyone to compete because they would now be so large, one of the largest employers actually in the country. And so there were a number of lawsuits, one of which was here in Colorado, and 2 other courts ruled against the merger, essentially not saying that it couldn't go through, but they essentially halted it. And as a result of that, Albertsons and Kroger are separated. Now they're starting their litigation about who was responsible for that. So that would have had major impacts. We would have seen hundreds of stores close here in Colorado. They were supposed to be sold to C&S Wholesale, who owns Piggly Wiggly, but they said they wouldn't be able to handle it. So I think that decision was the correct decision, actually.
Okay, and then there were obviously the cases surrounding funeral homes that I think a lot of people remember that actually have now led to new legislation.
Yes, exactly. So the funeral home litigation, I went back through my notes. We went through so many different cases, and it was from the most bizarre and egregious situations possible. Dead bodies just lying around, decomposed, giving people ashes that weren't their loved ones. It was cement sometimes. Sometimes it was a mixture of people. I mean, just the funeral industry. And Colorado was one of the last states to be regulated. We deregulated in 1983. And since then, you don't have to really do anything to run a funeral home, and we're now seeing that. So as a result, Jordan, as you mentioned, we now have this litigation that the state legislature passed, which is very significant. You have to have a professional mortuary science degree. You have to pass a national board exam, do a 1-year apprenticeship, do a criminal background. All of these things, which is we're seeing now, should have been in place because the families of these victims were just completely traumatized by this situation.
Yeah, as if the one in Penrose wasn't enough. That kind of started it off. Then we had the one in Littleton with Apollo Cremation Services.
Yes.
I mean, it was a big thing this whole year.
And I think it was really eye-opening, too. A lot of people didn't even know you didn't have to have some of these steps required to be able to run a funeral home.
And the legislature's giving them until 2026 to comply. So you're going to see, hopefully, things be cleaned up for sure.
Yeah. All right. Number 1 on your list is tied to President-elect Donald Trump.
Right. And of course, it's like, which case? There were so many this year and even in the previous years. But this one deals with the immunity of a former president and that decision from the Supreme Court, which I think is going to have significant impact. And the question was whether a former president enjoys presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. And the court said yes. They are immune from criminal prosecution for official acts. And so they did make this distinction between official and unofficial. So this is hugely important, I think, not only for the next Trump administration, because we saw him push the limits in every way, shape, and form. So now, if he knows he has this immunity, will that cause even further pushing of the boundaries and then future presidents? Now, we have a common law system. So this is a way that we actually develop our law, is the courts rule on it. And then as you get factual scenarios, they'll rule on it. So we're starting to develop our law. So that's a good thing. That's a positive. But this immunity, I know, has a lot of people kind of nervous.
All right, a lot happened in 2024. Some I think we forgot about, but Whitney, we appreciate you staying on top of it all year long.
Yep, my pleasure. Looking forward to 2025.
Yeah, we'll see what awaits.
Yep.